Okay, let me welcome everybody and say thank you to Olivier Garnier, who will be the chair of today's Chair Banque de France lecture, and I suggest we can start now.
Okay, thank you, Tobias, and good morning to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to chair this conference where we have two distinguished speakers with Ricardo Reis and Daniel Cohen. So no need to introduce them because they're well known. Just to say, as you know, that Ricardo is Phillips Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. I cannot resist also to say that in 2017, he was the recipient of the Banque de France School of Economics Junior Prize. So it's a sign that we had a good feeling when we gave this prize. And Daniel is a professor of economics at Paris School of Economics. As you know, this conference is co-organized by Banque de France and Paris School of Economics. And Daniel is also professor of École Normale Supérieure and director of the CEPREMAP. And both institutions, PSE and CEPREMAP, have also very strong links with Banque de France. So the topic of this conference, of course, couldn't be more timely because maybe 2 years ago, you know, when some people like Olivier Blanchard, when discussing fiscal policy, when the rate of interest is below the growth rate of the economy, it was more a kind of academic debate. Now, following the pandemic crisis, you know, we could say that governments put that in practice. We had in, you know, in France, the president said, "Quoi qu'il en coûte, whatever it takes." So it's in the US now we have the Biden plan. So it's kind of the question is whether or not this open bar is sustainable, and I think it will be very interesting to discuss that with Ricardo, to see also the relationship, the implications for monetary policy. And Daniel is also, he has for a long time worked on the question of debt dynamics, and I think it will be a very exciting discussion. Just to give you also the rules of the game. So Ricardo will have about 1 hour for the lecture. Then Daniel will have 15 minutes for the discussion, and then we will have a Q&A. Just to say that during the lecture, your mics will be shut, and so if you want to ask just a clarification question, you can put the question in the chat box, and then Tobias maybe will interrupt Ricardo, which is just to explain something. But during the Q&A, the mics will be opened. And let me finish by thanking the organizers, so Tobias Brouwer, Olivier Debord, Francesco Papada, and Julia Schmidt, as well as the logistics and communication teams at PSE and Banque de France for their organization. So thanks to everybody, and now Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, merci Olivier. It's a pleasure to be here, of course, and see already some friends in the audience. Of course, you would be having now been stuck for months and months in gray and rainy London. It would be much more pleasant to be in sunny Paris, but we have to do what we can, and so at least we'll have a nice chat, I hope, about this very pressing topic, because as Olivier says, this is a very, very pressing topic, which is on account of the large, and I would add necessary and adequate fiscal expansions that we've had over the last year, but also as an accumulation of debt that hadn't really stopped since the last great financial recession. What we have today is that we have record high levels of public debt in pretty much the entire, not just OECD, but also emerging market economies. So the question of how is it that we will manage that debt, how, if ever, will we pay for it, and even perhaps more pressing, is there even any limit on how much debt we can take now that we've broken all records in terms of how high that debt can be? Those are the questions that I think are extremely pressing, important, and this is my modest contribution to think of them. My starting point, as Olivier already hinted, is definitely Olivier Blanchard's presidential address. I discussed with Olivier many times as he wrote part of it while visiting the LIC for a few weeks just before delivering it. And Olivier made the very shrewd points that we had well-established economic theory that said that when R is less than G, the arithmetics of debt, but more importantly, the welfare implications, as well as constraints on public debt, can change quite dramatically relative to a situation in which G is less than R. At the same time, though, Olivier implicitly in his models had always that M was the same as R. And what do I mean by M here? I mean, this is the return on private assets. In other words, he was always looking at economies that were dynamically inefficient, in which there's been too much capital accumulation. And as a result, the marginal part of capital had been driven below the growth rate of the economy. If one looks at the data, and this is simply the data for the United States, since it's easier, although this is not in particular a United States story, and one compares G, red lines, and R, blue lines, these are the expected from a survey of professional forecasters. These are the actual average over 10 years. These are, and this is the same as that one. Then what you see is that the blue lines are indeed always below the red lines, and perhaps more striking, that gap has widened over the last decade, thus motivating all of this work. But if one goes and measures M from either corporate bond returns or stock price returns, to take two simple measures of what that is, whether those are expected or actual, they have tended to be above the growth of the economy. If one calculates them instead from direct measure the marginal part of capital by simply looking at capital payments divided by outputs, a measure of average part of capital, or doing some adjustments for potential how much of labor payments are entrepreneurial payments or others, again, you end up with very decisive M's above G's. And finally, using just a little bit more of economic theory, just a tiny little bit of economic theory, and this is the very influential paper almost 30 years ago by Andrew Abel and company on dynamic efficiency conditions. If one is to compare the capital income to investment, so yellow to this reddish, I guess, dark red here, a condition for dynamic efficiency, i.e., in my words, a condition for G less than M, is that yellow should be above dark red, and it's very much above dark red. Or alternatively, using a similar argument, looking at the investment to output ratio, the red line, the question there is that decisively above or below the growth rate? And here, it's again very clear that at 20+% where it is. So, in short, the data seems to suggest, and many people have written this in different ways, this is not exactly a new realization, that G is less than M. Indeed, if one goes a decade earlier and thinks about another extremely influential piece of work by a different French economist, Thomas Piketty, when he talked about R is bigger than G, he meant M, is what I'm calling M. The returns or accumulation of capital are above G. So this is Blanchard meets Piketty, if you want, in terms of why, because Olivier was talking about R as the return on safe debt. Thomas was talking about the interest rate that people seem to be earning in capital markets, in private markets, as he was discussing inequality. Now, what is the implication of this then for us to think about the constraints on the public debt? Let me start with some, I want to say simple, but simple often in economics is taken to be lots of simplistic assumptions. This is simple but extremely general. Debt arithmetics or dynamics. Let me establish some notation. The total deficit, the change in the debt, by definition, is equal to the primary deficit. I'm going to take S to be net spending, does S, but it's the primary deficit, plus the interest payments on the debt. But think about this as just the return on the debt. These may include both promised interest, it may include capital gains or losses, it may include inflating or deflating the debt. Either way, this simply says that the total deficit is equal to the primary deficit plus the payments to the bondholders. And so it's a very, very general setup. Now, how you measure B can be very complicated insofar as you have debts of lots of different maturities, different characteristics and others. This return, like I said, can have different components. The spending, my God, as you know very well, open a budget and there's lines and lines of different revenues and outlays, but this is a dynamic equation that always seems to hold. What I want to do in this talk is take as exogenous how much spending can be done And given this form, the easiest way to think about it is think about the spending as a ratio of debt. Okay, we can also think about spending by itself without the ratio of debt, but it does, well, you'll see why it makes sense to talk about spending as a ratio of debt. But what this equation shows very well is obviously that B is endogenous. How much you spend determines how fast you accumulate debt, but also the interest payments on the debt, the outlays in paying interest is surely endogenous, and the growth rate of the economy in which this debt exists or lives is also going to be an endogenous object. The goal of this paper is to understand, given the exogeneity of S over B, this paper of this lecture, given the exogeneity of S over B, how high can B get, taking into account the endogeneity of R and G. But to start with, it's useful to keep R and G as given, as exogenous, and thus do what I'm going to call some debt arithmetics. First, it follows immediately from this equation that if the debt over GDP is constant in the very long run, so if DB over B is equal to the growth rate of output, so that debt to GDP is neither exploding to plus infinity nor exploding to minus infinity, okay, which seems very reasonable and something that you can easily get out of an economic as being necessary for an equilibrium, then if this side is equal to G and this is R and this is S over B, it follows immediately by basic algebra that this B is equal to S divided by G minus R. Now, what this shows is that the G minus R is indeed an important inflection point, if you want. But why? Because it says that if as used to be the case, R was above G, to have a positive amount of debt outstanding, you needed to have primary surpluses. Whereas when now G is bigger than R, and let's say that that's indeed the new state of the world, you can now have permanent deficits. Moreover, this extremely simple debt arithmetics tells you that how much can you spend S as a ratio of debt, B? Well, that's exactly what G minus R gives you, okay? But a third thing it does, which I already incorporated here with my max operator, is that, yes, that just follows from setting this to G and solving this equation, but of course, that may either be consistent or not with an equilibrium in which debt is positive value. Another solution to this differential equation is B equals 0, in which case this will hold. Therefore, it must be that B, for this to be true, is above 0 or simply equal to 0. That's likewise a solution to that extremely simple differential equation, okay? This says, well, is there then some limit after which if you do a lot more spending, the debt simply falls right away to the 0? Let's do some simple back of the envelope, again, debt arithmetics. For instance, if we take the current debt to GDP in France at the end of 2020, which is 98% of GDP, and you take a very generous G minus R of 2%, which has been, again, the last 5 years or so, then what this says is that persistently, permanently, the Trésor could sustain a spending of 2% of GDP per year forever, okay? Alternatively, again, very simple back of the envelope, if you say that, look, but if you just spend more, simply debt would grow more. Well, but if you think that debt cannot grow above net private assets in the economy, net private assets in the economy in France, again, at the end of 2020, were roughly 170% of GDP, then it says that, yes, we could just borrow a lot more, all the way to 170% of GDP, exhaust all of the net private assets, and have the spending rise to 3.4% by, again, very simple algebra. Note right away, just from this very simple algebra, that given that the average primary deficit in the last 5 years, sorry, this should have been 19, was 1.4% in France, that means that, well, most of the fiscal room driven by G minus R had already been spent, was already being spent. There isn't just a lot more for any more persistent spending, okay? But, as important, these are back of the envelope debt arithmetics, meaning if you did this permanently, as opposed to whatever it is that we're doing now, if you try to raise B to get to private assets, surely G and R would change, as would, by the way, net private assets, and therefore these calculations are naturally highly incomplete. These are not forecasts, they're back of the envelope sense of what limits are. But let's go a little further beyond permanent deficits to recurrent deficits. Consider a balanced growth path where, again, if GDP is growing at a rate G ultimately, then debt and spending are also going to have to grow at a rate G, just so that the government doesn't become irrelevant as time goes to infinity. Looking at this equation, you can just say, aha, I learned this in graduate school at some point. Let me just integrate this forward. It's a differential equation with an RT. That's fantastic. I know how to do this. I can integrate that forward, and let me take a limit as t goes to infinity. I have no citations in the paper on people who have done this, but some people will have done this. And then they look at this term and they say, hold on, if B is growing at rate G, and since this is an R, and that ultimately is converging into some R that's below G, this blue term is plus infinity. And then great imagination takes over and you say, aha, there is no government budget constraint. The government budget constraint is an obsolete concept once R is less than G. This, sadly, is an application of bad mathematics. The limit of a sum is not equal to the sum of the limits. Indeed, you can see that the first limit is going to minus infinity, so you simply cannot do that. Good mathematics, this is just bad mechanical application of differential equations. Good mathematics is to look at this equation and realize, let me iterate it forward by discounting by some process dt that's strictly above gt. If you do that, you can take those limits. This is now well-defined limits, and you end up with this expression, okay? At least, so there is a government budget constraint of some kind. Note that, again, this is for any arbitrary d. Indeed, this math can even be trivial insofar as if you take d to be extremely high, say infinity, this term becomes 0, and this term is equal to b0. So all this equation says is b0 equals to b0. There's no economics here. It's just some mathematics to at least not screw up, not make a bad mistake and embarrass yourself like you do when you do this and say, oh, infinity. Okay. There is, though, an economic application of this very simple mathematical point, which is take d to be m. Because remember, m has been in the data bigger than g. And so it is mathematically correct to use m as my discount d. Not all that is mathematically correct. This now has an economic meaning, makes economic sense. There is a reason why you should, not just can, but should use m as your discount factor. This expression now says that the debt today is the sum of two terms. The market present value of surpluses or deficits plus a bubble term. Let me start with the present market value of surplus to tell you that m is the right discount rate. First, recall that m, being the marginal part of capital, is the return you can make on investments. Therefore, from asset pricing theory, it is a valid stochastic discount factor to discount future risky payoffs to agents who voluntarily choose to hold this private capital this M refers to. Moreover, since the marginal holder of the debt could also invest in capital, it follows from his or her arbitrage condition in choosing to hold some capital and some debt that M is the discount factor that they would use that would show up in their Euler equation when they choose to hold government debt. And thirdly, the condition M bigger than G is nothing but the transversality condition, in other words, the dynamic efficiency condition, such that the agent, which recall is an optimality condition for the agent to want to hold any debt in the first place. So this M is a valid STF, and it tells you that, yes, debt has to be backed by the present value of surpluses. At the same time, when R is less than G, and M is bigger than G as well, you have a new term. And what is this new term? Well, M minus R is a premium that the government debt pays relative to the private debt, or if you want, why is it that government debt can sell at a high price or pay a low return than private capital does? This is a benefit that accrues to the government, as the budget constraint says here, not just implicitly, but de facto in terms of resources by issuing debt. The premium times the total amount of debt issued is exactly the bubble revenues. I call this a bubble because literature is often called that when you have that an asset pays a return less than the marginal part of capital, we'll call this a bubble. But to be clear, other literatures call this the convenience yield on debt, in empirical literature especially, and even other literature often linking this to, well, what happens when debt is money and money pays zero interest, and then this animal would be nothing but the nominal interest rate, and then you'd recognize this as the seigniorage term that shows up in a standard model of money, where money is a bubble in the sense of a dominated asset, okay? We discount by M minus G, because this B is growing at G, but M minus R is the bubble term. So this shows you that it's not really G minus R that matters. What matters is really even if only because, for instance, M minus G also lower this term, It's rather M minus R, the bubble premium, the convenience illusinage. This relaxes the budget constraint of the government because the government is getting some revenues from being able to be in this amazing situation where R in the last few years has been so well below marginal products of capital. Okay. Next, let me skip this, but just to say that if there was aggregate uncertainty, nothing changes. Throughout this paper, I'm going to do deterministic models in terms of aggregate uncertainty. There's going to be a lot of idiosyncratic risk, but aggregate uncertainty makes no difference whatsoever to anything that I say, and I'll even talk about some extensions that happen. Okay. Now, that's what the arithmetics can tell. The arithmetics can make sense of what's the right way to write the budget constraint. It tells you there is a budget constraint, there is a limit to it, and that if you want to understand R minus G and why that matters, what you really want to understand is M minus R. But this leaves open as many questions if you want, or more than the ones it answered, as I guess useful arithmetics always does. Why is M bigger than G bigger than R in the first place? If you want to understand whether we want to use this, why are we considering? I mean, what is this coming from? And so that if we want to assume this is going to persist forever, as I implicitly did, that's kind of the starting point here. Why is it? First, if I spend more, how does that affect the equilibrium M minus R and B, and therefore the bubble? So can I really do this thing that I'd hear of, oh, imagine the S was bigger while keeping the G minus R and the B implicitly fixed? Obviously not, but how does it change? What is the largest spending? I'm going to call it capital S. I'm going to call this the fiscal capacity, such that we don't fall to the B equals 0 equilibrium. And fourthly, how do other fiscal monetary policies affect both the fiscal amount of spending as well as the fiscal capacity? So what I'm going to be doing, certainly building on many of the people who have done built different models of different types, is offer you a model that endogenizes M, R, G, and S to answer these questions. Okay? Now, what model do I want to write? Well, what I really want to write is a model that generates this. And luckily, there's an empirical literature that has tried to, over the last 5 to 10 years, try to make sense of why is it that government bonds seem to pay less than M, so much less than even below G. And that literature has emphasized two very important factors, or 3 important factors. I'm gonna just model 2 of them. One is
Ricardo,
that.
Excuse me to interrupt. There's a question by Nuno Coimbra whether we're not ignoring the risk premium here arising from the correlation between M and the actual stochastic discount factor. And I think that relates to your aggregate risk.
Yes. So with aggregate risk, as I told you, the same conclusions of everything I said in these 20 minutes still hold. We still have an expectation of the spending. We still have a bubble term, right? Then, likewise, the conclusions, the lessons that I'm going to do next, which have to do with endogeneity of M and R, every single one of them still holds if you have at least some forms of aggregate uncertainty, right? What changes, as Nuno rightly points, is the size of this term. If there is a correlation, a covariance between the bubble term and the stochastic discount factor, in other words, if its beta is positive or negative, this term can be bigger or smaller. There's an active literature on which there's very nice papers by Jiang, Lustig, Van Nieuwerburg, and Xiaolan, who have been trying to, over the last 6 months, essentially measure these using some models of the stochastic discount factor, and have been arguing that this term is very small, and it's very hard to get betas that get this term very big. And so they call this a debt valuation puzzle. But that is a quantitative question. Everything that I'm going to do is qualitative, and all of that holds regardless of that aggregate uncertainty, whether it's there or not. Okay, so but that's what I'm going to be doing. Why am I going to be ignoring the aggregate uncertainty? One, well, I'll show you how it changes things in an extension. But secondly, because I just wanted to focus on some new things. And again, there's this empirical literature that has been focusing on that. Okay, and so I just wanted to kind of do things that are a little different, focus on some things that have not been as explored. But good question. Okay, so as I told you, reasons why R is low. One, government bonds provide liquidity. And maybe that's why after 2010, R fell so much more relative to G. Because financial regulation, fear from the financial crisis, and others have meant that government debt became much more useful as collateral to satisfy regulators and others, and therefore the liquidity premium has become a big part of what the bubble premium is. Second, government debt is safe. Government debt gives you a safety that aggregate uncertainty on the capital stock, say, doesn't have, and people want to hold government debt because it's safe. Either foreigners again, the proverbial Chinese who hold all these US treasuries, or simply private citizens want to hold safe debt. That is a safety premium. Safety plus liquidity premium is what a lot of the empirical literature that has been trying to measure this M minus R as focused on. So I'm going to write the simplest model I can of those two. In particular, I'm going to think of a world in which households or sectors, some of us have inferior investment opportunities and some have superior investment opportunities. Some have better ideas, better projects, we're not. In an efficient economy, simply those with low ideas, low quality of capital, if you want, would lend money to those with high capital, would share on the high returns to capital, and that would be it. However, there's going to be an inability to ensure that you get paid back when you lend, and as a result, there's going to be a constraint on the size of the private market. Public debt then provides what? This creates a role for public debt. Given that in the private markets, I have a limit to how much I can lend without the borrower running away, it means that now, because I want to transfer liquidity from today when I have a bad project to tomorrow when I may end up having a really good project, I want to save. Public debt provides me a saving vehicle, a store of value, a form of liquidity. The gap M minus R then is partly this liquidity premium, and that's going to be higher the less I can lend in private financial markets. Second, capital is going to have a risky idiosyncratic return. Again, it could be aggregate, but idiosyncratic so that I distinguish from the aggregate literature. Okay. Why? Financial markets are incomplete. When I invest in something, I need to bear some risk. But then, as a result of standard optimal portfolio choice, you give me a safe asset, public debt, I want to hold a little bit of it to hedge against the risk that I have from my idiosyncratic investment opportunity. Thus, there will be a demand for public debt and its safe returns. With that demand comes a safety premium that is higher the higher is risk and the desire to search for refuge from that risk. Okay? In terms of equations, it's a very simple model of a neoclassical firm that maximizes an AK production technology, but where there's different types of capital. There's ex ante, we have capital types, Q, on which there's a distribution in the population. And the Q says that relative to the marginal amount of capital, the most efficient firm, my productivity of a particularly low type of capital is going to be lower by Q. At the same time, these ex ante different capital types also suffer ex post depreciation risk. Ex post, we're going to have that there's going to be a depreciation such that some entrepreneurs are going to suffer, some households or some firm are going to suffer from more of a loss of capital than others. The high quality types are high quality both in terms of their average returns as well as in terms of their potentially higher volatility of depreciation. But then these households, they have to choose whether to hold government bonds, lend in private markets, or invest in capital, knowing that there's these different returns to it and consuming. But, and crucially, here is the borrowing constraint. I can only borrow, if I borrow, so I said L negative, such that my total payments from the loans do not exceed the return that I get from my capital, and crucially, this parameter, this fraction gamma. This is a Kiyotaki-Moore type constraint that says, look, I can only pledge a fraction gamma of my total revenue, and therefore that's the maximum amount that I'll be able to borrow ex ante. Markets clear, inside assets, private credit markets, and the outside asset being the government bond. And that's it. That's the entire model. If you have that gamma is equal to 1, this model is the following extremely simple solution. All the households are going to save, as in a standard Euler equation, interest rate minus rho. That's going to be the increase of the savings. Since we're all identical, we're going to save the same amount. There's zero inequality in this economy. What happens is that everyone that has a Q less than 1 is simply going to lend to the Q equals 1 entrepreneur. That entrepreneur is going to operate all the high quality capital that he or she has, and we're all going to get the return such that M, the return on that capital, is going to be equal to R, that's going to be equal to RB, that's going to be equal to RL, and that's going to be simply the equilibrium in this economy. Okay? Which is bigger than the growth rate, which is equal to R minus rho from the standard Euler equation. Difference here is that some of these low quality guys now are not going to be able to send all their capital to the high quality guys. And that's really it. There's the investment risk from the risk return depreciation. There is the liquidity role from the inferior Q that I was talking about. Now,
let's talk then about a balanced growth path here, where we're solving for the interest rate on the government debt. We're solving for how much debt is being held. I'm going to talk in terms of this kappa, which is debt over the capital stock. But again, you can do any transformation, but because everything's growing, you do have to scale things somehow. And the endogenous growth rate. And as I told you before, I'm going to keep S over B exogenous. That is the amount of spending over B. Why? The whole question in this paper is there a limit to how much you can spend? Why scale it over B? Simply because in this permanent growth path, you see that everything here is scaled S over B. So it makes sense to talk about S over B as being the scaling. But I'll also show you what happens if you scale S by assets or capital stock or output, and so on. Okay. Now, I'm going to restrict attention to equilibria where this is true and this is true. We do permanent spending and R is less than G than M. Okay. Those are the equilibria I care about. I want whether these exist, whether there's a constraint on their size. Turns out that it's relatively easy to show that equilibrium exists as long as there's an upper bound on the S, which is what I told you I'm going to call fiscal capacity. And so I'm going to solve endogenously for the big S and for especially the M minus R, which is the bubble premium, as well as the kappa, which gives you the size of how much you can exploit this bubble premium. Let me also tell you that there's a simpler version of the model, which turns out to get all of the results, even simpler. I mean, I thought this is as simple as it gets, but there's an even simpler version where I get rid of the investment and only have the liquidity or misallocation of capital bit. And that is a type in which there's two types. There's no depreciation shocks. There's just a high type that gets the MPK, and there's a low type whose capital is never used because it's dreadful, and the share 1 minus alpha of those, okay? And the nice thing about that very simple model is that you can literally stare at the two equilibrium conditions. What are the equilibrium conditions? Well, the high types, the growth is coming from investing in the high quality, right? The low quality gives you nothing, gives you no output. Well, that is the growth rate that you can get from borrowing at R and investing at M. Well, there's alphas of agents, such agents, who get their return and on top of it are able to leverage because of their ability to borrow from the others. So this is the growth rate of the economy in some ways, or the growth rate minus the interest rate, which is just the returns on the capital. Well, that must finance the S over B, right? So the S over B from the government budget constraint, the growth of the economy must be financing, because of that G minus R effect, how much S over B spending there is. Secondly, there's also how large can debt be? Let's start with a simple case which gamma is 0. If gamma is 0, it says that there's no private lending and borrowing. Well, then it's very easy. 1 minus alpha of agents are low type, they hold debt. Alpha of agents hold capital because capital is so much better than debt. Remember, M is bigger than G. So 1 minus alpha over alpha gives you the debt to capital ratio. As gamma rises, then these low types start instead lending to the high types, and therefore the amount of debt held that they wish to hold falls. And that's as simple as it gets. Okay. Then the nice thing about these two equations is that the solution of the model then is again very simple and recursive. We start with some S over B star spending. That from this condition here tells you what the interest rate must be. Given that interest rate, you read off what the bond holdings are. Okay. Now, importantly though, we have that. So let's just start with that. Now, what happens then if there's an increase? Sorry, the S got cut here. If there's an increase in spending, more spending means an equilibrium with a lower interest rate. Why? The only way we can sustain more spending is if there's a larger bubble premium. There has to be a larger, in this case, liquidity premium on the debt. That's just the only way for that to happen. But if the interest rate is lower, what happens at a lower interest rate is that, well, higher spending, you go here, of course. And so if it goes up, we go to lower interest rate. But at a lower interest rate, people want to hold the low types want to hold less bonds. Okay, and so kappa falls. So you get a higher bubble premium, but a lower ratio of public debt to private assets. Moreover, inequality has just increased. And why has inequality increased? Because these guys, they're earning, the high quality guys, they're earning the marginal part of capital leveraged up. And if anything, they can leverage more now that the interest rate fell. Whereas these guys are earning, the low quality types are earning a lower interest rate. So inequality of income has really gone up in terms of the income these two earn. Moreover, though, what happens to the fiscal capacity? Well, what you can see here is that if S over B exceeds capital S, the resulting interest rates would have to be below this level here. But if it was below this level, there is no equilibrium with positive debt holdings. But you can't short public debt. Public debt has to be positive equilibrium. So here there's no equilibrium, and you see clearly that there's an upper bound on S over B, which simply rearranging is equal to this expression. But then you get that crucially, the higher is financial development, or the more high productivity types there are, which is nothing but saying that this economy in financially works better, the private credit markets work better. Well, better private credit markets crowds out the public debt's whole role or usefulness, and therefore the amount of spending that you can use. Why? Because it lowers any bubble premium that can be earned. General model, essentially the same insights. It's just that now, given a distribution, you're going to have still low types that have really low quality and therefore just save in bonds and or lend in private markets. You still have some very high types who borrow as much as they can, invest in capital, but now you also have some intermediate types who hold some capital and some bonds, unlike in the simple economy. So now the two equilibrium equations are somewhat similar, but now you have these new terms in that on top of the high quality types, you have the intermediate types, and on the bond holdings, there's the bond holdings of the very low quality types, but also the bond holdings of the intermediate types. But the proposition turns out to be it's the same. The only novelty is now that because there's risk, there's also a risk premium. The more idiosyncratic risk there is in the economy that I can't insure, then the more I want to hold public debt in order to insure against that, in order to hedge against that risk. And as the extra demand on public debt increases the fiscal capacity S, we can sustain more fiscal spending because people are willing to pay as a high bubble premium on account of the risk they bear. Okay? Now, let me talk about immediately three important extensions. What if instead of S over B, I had a fiscal rule that chooses spending over assets? Okay. Well, the model in the simple case of the two types gets modified to now, the slightly more complicated equation where you still have the blue line, which was this left-hand side, but now the right-hand side, instead of being a constant, a horizontal line, is a downward sloping line that always has the following shape. Now, what do we mean by there's no fiscal capacity limit? It's just that the more you spend, orange line shifts up, and at some point, orange line doesn't intersect blue line. That's now the fiscal capacity limit. Same way as before, orange line was a horizontal line that as it went too much up above this point, it at some point didn't intersect the blue line. So that's where that new one is, the new fiscal capacity. But secondly, now you see that on top of the R1 star equilibrium, which has all the same properties as before, with a different fiscal rule, you can have a run on the debt of multiple equilibrium. Why? Because we can be in this equilibrium where the interest rate on the debt is low and we have a certain amount of public debt, or we can very quickly jump to an equilibrium where agents say, hold on, I now require a very high interest rate on the debt. As I require a much higher interest rate on the debt, the bubble premium falls and the debt is much higher, thus why you end up with the same bubble revenue. And that's why there's two equilibrium. In other words, we will observe some instances in which debt shoots up and interest rates shoot up, exactly as we see in sovereign debt crisis. But here it's a very funny or kind of, I found, insightful different kind of crisis. It's simply that with the spending may trigger a shift to this other equilibrium where the interest rate on the debt goes up and that goes up. So in other words, a government which has become used to, I don't know if I wanted to be more provocative, addicted to the bubble premium to sustain its spending, finds that as there's a run on its debt, it needs to issue more and more debt to keep the spending going in order to keep this bubble revenues going. And that's what leads to a jump to that other equilibrium. This equilibrium, by the way, is welfare worse than the first one because it crowds out more capital. Second, the depreciation, the aggregate uncertainty that Nuno was asking about. Imagine how the depreciation risk has an aggregate component, okay? Turns out that three different, so this is, by the way, the intimidating looking equilibrium condition now, but even though it's intimidating, it's actually the exact same logic as you had before. But now you have that, look, if you have a bad shock, sure, you have to lower spending just for the equilibrium to hold. But if you say conditional on the fact that now S has to respond to these DZ shocks, whenever there's a bad shock to the economy, you have to cut spending. A fiscal rule that responds to those, and then we look just at its average amount of debt, we end up with exactly the same expression as before. So nothing changed relative to Proposition 2, which is what I was telling you earlier, Nuno. There's a quantitative change in how big these terms can be, but not a qualitative change per se. However, there's an interesting new effect. An increase in uncertainty, which is again the one Nuno was raising, an increase in uncertainty lowers capital holdings. Why? Because it's now riskier to hold a capital. And this would show up also as a beta term if I would do this quantitatively. There is safety premium in lower R. So the more uncertainty is the economy, the more spending you can do. Again, I will note, again, somewhat provocatively, that recessions are times of high uncertainty. We see a lot more debt than being possible. The governments are able to issue a lot more debt. They're able to spend a lot more without getting into a crisis. You can spend more in a recession. Why? Because in a recession, there's more uncertainty, and that relaxes the budget constraint of the government. We tend to think of recessions as tightening budget constraint because you lower your tax revenues and have to pay more unemployment insurance. The bubble premium goes in the opposite direction, actually relaxes the budget constraint. Okay. Next point, what if there's a foreign demand for bonds? Here's again the equation, but let's just go over the predictions. Look, if there was perfect capital availability, then of course that fixes an interest rate, fixing the interest rate, that fixes a bubble premium. Now there's a unique S over B. It's not just the capacity. You can sustain some spending if you're lucky. If the interest rates change, there's just less spending. There's none of the changes in allocation, misallocation had in the economy. More interestingly is the between the two. What if the gap between the domestic interest rate and the foreign interest rate imply a downward sloping demand for the government bonds? Okay. Note, by the way, this is open economy in the sense of foreign demand for goods, for bonds, for government bonds, not foreign private capital, not private capital financed by foreign investment. That will be a different thing, which I can talk about in the Q&A. Here, the proposition holds just the same, but now you get a much sharper relation between spending and the bond holdings. In other words, you reach the capital S much faster. The capacity is higher, but it's reached much, much faster than before. So that's how that changes. Now, in my last 15 minutes, comes though the policy exercises, the next type of exercise I want to do. Here's the two questions I want to ask. I want to ask, as we do monetary and fiscal policy, what are the trade-offs that this implies? In particular, two questions. If I do some policy and keeping everything else fixed, this is the more, let's say, theoretically standard one, what happens to the fiscal capacity? S. Does it shrink? Does it increase? But let me ask a slightly different question at the same time. When I change a policy, I'm going to do policies like inflation, financial repression, redistribution, taxation, but I'm going to keep R fixed. That is, if the bubble premium is fixed, does this raise or lower the total amount of spending that you could do? Okay, I'm going to call this fiscal space. You know what this says is, now that we've isolated that M minus R is really the business, and M, remember in this model, by the way, is fixed. It's just minus bar capital. If M minus R hasn't changed, but B has changed, the bubble revenues will have changed, how much fiscal space has changed or not? In that sense in which these are complementary, but slightly different questions, right? Can you spend more for the same bubble premium? Do you reach a collapse of fiscal crisis now for the same amount of spending, but with the bubble premium being the key endogenous variable? Okay, experiment one. What if we have inflation? Let me just say that, hey, let me just add inflation. Price, pi t is expected inflation, sigma pi is volatility of inflation. Okay? How does this change the model? Well, the only thing that changed is that the government budget constraint now includes these inflation shocks. Why doesn't pi t show up? Pi t doesn't show up because that just shows up in the return on the debt, meaning a higher pi t just means that since this is expected inflation, means that in equilibrium, nominal interest rates have to be higher to give the same real return to the bondholder. Okay? RT was the real return to the bondholder, and that's going to be pinned down in equilibrium. However, a positive shock to inflation is going to lower the debt because it inflates away some of the debt. Proposition. The first one was clear already. Change in expected inflation has no consequences on anything. Why? Because it doesn't change spending bill of the government, because the R is going to adjust endogenously. But, and more interesting, what happens if there's a higher variance, a higher sigma pi of inflation? Well, a higher sigma pi lowers both the capacity and the fiscal space. Why? Ex post, a positive shock to inflation is great. It lowers your debt, means you can spend more. You inflated it. Of course, ex post, positive shocks to inflation, on average, are met by negative shocks to inflation. So on average, these ex post effects are zero. More interesting is that ex ante, the presence of these shocks means that the debt is no longer safe. It now has inflation risk. Because there's inflation risk, the bubble safety premium is lower. And with a lower bubble safety premium, the government budget constraint is tighter. That means that there's no conflict between the bank and the Trésor. The way in which, in this world of M bigger than G bigger than R, what the bank should do is pursue price stability lower sigma pi as possible. Why? Because that's what will make the nominal debt issued by the Trésor as safe as possible, and that will lead to a larger bubble premium, and as a result, more fiscal space and more fiscal capacity. Second, financial repression. Imagine that some of the debt is coerced, not just voluntary. In particular, we know that financial repression usually consists of having the government force liabilities sold at above market price or paying a below market return to its holders in order to repressing the bondholders, the creditors of financial markets, getting cheap financing from the government. That is the history of financial repression. Let me do this in a relatively simple way by saying there's this other type of debt which pays zero, whereas the voluntary debt pays the RT. So the government debt constraint changes because now instead of all the debt paying R, only the voluntary one pays R. The other one, it's coerced. I force everyone to use it, and I pay them nothing for it in terms of net returns. I just give them their money back afterwards. Obviously, if you don't like zero, put 35, any number you want. It's not really. The key is that it's below the market value. What happens if you increase the share of the debt that is coerced, BC over B? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, that raises fiscal capacity and fiscal space. If you force people to hold your debt, you can borrow more, and thus you can spend more. Well, unsurprising, yes, but surprising or at least interesting because of, again, of what this does to the bubble premium. And again, all of this model, what it's showing is that thinking in terms of M minus R is the right thing to do, and or not just the right thing to do, it's an insightful kind of new, different way of thinking about the government budget constraint. What the financial repression does is that now the debt not only earns a safety premium and potentially liquidity premium, there's also a repression premium. Some of the debt can now just pay a very low interest rate, well below M. How low? Zero, even below the voluntary one. This unambiguously loosens the government debt constraint. It is a quick solution to any fiscal trouble is to increase this because you're going to raise the fiscal capacity in that space. But in this economy, this worsens the allocation of capital and lowers growth. Okay? But again, through the bubble premium. Third, and now going to more surprising ones. These two are maybe not surprising, even if the channel is different than what you may be used to thinking about. Third, imagine that I tax the high quality types, their assets, and just give them to the low quality types. So I do a redistribution of assets. I say these guys are going to earn very high return. These are going to be very low return. I'm going to do a lump sum redistribution of wealth from the rich guys to the poor guys. Okay? How much share of assets I take from the rich guys? Phi. Okay? A larger phi, a larger distribution program lowers the fiscal capacity and lowers the fiscal space. Why? Because when I take money from the rich guys to the poor guys, what do the poor guys want to do with their newfound wealth? Well, they want to lend it to the rich guys in the private capital markets to get access to the high returns. But the private capital markets are constrained in size. Instead, these guys, as they're trying to lend and as they would like to lend, they want to lend even more. In other words, the public debt becomes even less desirable. They just really want to lend in the private capital markets. As they want to lend in the private capital markets, that lowers the bubble premium. The desirability of chasing the high returns is now even higher. Okay? As a result, because financial repression prevents the flow of assets, actually the government can now spend less. Okay? Either spend less in the sense of fiscal space right away or in terms of lowering fiscal capacity. What this implies is the following interesting corollary. There is a conflict now between, let's talk about two policymakers. Imagine the alternating power, the blue policymakers and the red policymakers. Blue policymakers hate inequality. They want to do a lot of redistribution. Red policymakers love public spending. They want to build highways, roads, do other kinds of, G as opposed to T if you want, as opposed to transfers. Well, the more the blue policymaker lowers inequality, the less space there is for the red policymaker to do spending. Okay? With polarization, we know already that total spending often increases, a very rich literature on how polarization can lead to more spending. But here the novelty is that not only that, but polarization can lead to more risk that bubbles pop, bounds being reached higher. Why? Because with more polarization, we can have these different governments pursuing either redistribution or public spending, and these two, redistribution is going to lower the space there is for public spending. Fourth and final prediction, what about a proportional income tax? Imagine now that you tax the returns by a share tau, okay? I'm going to say for simplicity, you tax, this is a tax on income. Oh, wait. Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah, I think I froze. This is a tax on income, which in this model, there's just capital income. So it's a tax on all capital. But it's going to be a tax on all kinds of capital income. Could be bonds, could be the loans, could be the capital stock. Okay? So very simple. So that's a single tax rate. Now, also so that's the first point. Second point, I'm going to have that the tax revenues are actually rebated to the type Q that pay them, type per type, in a lump sum form. Meaning the agents don't understand this or their type is exogenous, they don't understand this depends, the amount of T depends on the tau. Why? I'm just trying to introduce a distortionary tax and no redistribution. Why? Because I already did the redistribution here. And I just want to separate the effect of the proportional income tax. But for those of you who understand how taxes do, you should mix the fact that taxes come with both redistribution and the taxation. Okay? Great. Now, because you can, important is how to put the tax here. How does the tax modify the collateral constraint? Well, we pay taxes, corporations pay taxes every month, not just at the end of the debt contracts. And I would say, unarguably, it's much harder to avoid paying taxes than to avoid paying private debts. Therefore, it seems reasonable to say that you can pledge in the private market only the after-tax revenue that you collect. You can't say, I'm going to pay the private creditors and not pay the taxpayer. You can do the other way around. Thus, the 1 minus tau shows up here. Now, with this modification of the model now, what happens if there's an increase in tau? An increase in tau that's rebated to each type of household raises capacity, but lowers fiscal space. Why is that? What this does is that the increase in tau is that it tightens the borrowing constraint. You can now borrow less. You are de facto, that effect is the same as having a lower gamma. But if you remember earlier, a lower gamma, a less developed financial system, meant that there was a higher fiscal capacity. Why? Now that you've basically, by doing the taxation, have meant that it's harder, there's less private credit activity. Because there's less private credit activity, there's more demand for public debt that increases the fiscal capacity. At the same time, though, this tax is going to lower growth, both because it allows the high-yielding marginal return guys to leverage, as well as because it lowers the incentives to save through the tau. Those two effects lower fiscal space. That is, outside of hitting the fiscal capacity, you can now spend less because there's less growth in this economy, because there's less of a bubble premium as a result. Okay? Note that, of course, on top of this effect that I isolated here, you'd have the direct effect that taxes raise revenue if you weren't going and transferring them back to the agent. But what this model highlights is that by taxation, lowering borrowing from productive types and increasing misallocation of capital, that will offset some of the direct revenue effect. So it may just be that a tax increase, or let me do it the other way around. It may just be that a tax cut pays for itself. Because even if it directly lowers revenues, it can increase private financial market activity and growth rates to the point where it actually increases the fiscal space. Again, novel, thinking about this in terms of bubble premium means that to measure if a tax cut safe rates for themselves, you're not measuring here elasticity of labor supply, as we're used to in Laffer curve land. Rather, you're measuring what happened to bubble premium. Did the bubble premium go up or down? Did this tax rate increase the desirability of public debt or lower desirability of public debt? And that is the new perspective that comes in. Now, let me then answer the questions I raised at the end of the arithmetics after this 30-minute or 25-minute detour into a model. How did the model answer this? Why is M bigger than J and R? Because of the safety and liquidity that provides, creating a bubble premium, a convenience yield, a seniorage that can pay for some spending. More spending raises the bubble premium, but lowers how much of the total bubble you can sustain. There is a finite limit to spending. It is small if the economy is less productive, has more developed financial markets and less risk. And as for policies, inflation turns out to backfire, repression works, but it's costly. Redistribution and taxation have somewhat surprising implications and create conflict in policymakers. To conclude my 3 minutes, I want to use my 4 minutes to draw policy lessons insofar as lessons, since this is a series of policymakers are in the audience here. I want to say, okay, let's step away from the model, the arithmetics, the math, and let me write down 9 lessons that I think this analysis taught me. The first lesson is one that we knew already, but it's important to restate, which is if we have a crisis like we had in 2020-21, and we want to run a one-time very large deficit, then as long as R is less than G, we can potentially almost never have to pay for it. Meaning we can run this very large deficit, buy a 10 or sell a 10 or 20-year bond to finance it. In 20 years, the amount that we pay is going to be a very small fraction of our GDP, and as a result, we can pay for it. However, note that this is a gamble that's feasible only if the spending keeps the R less than G. An old lesson. The sign of R minus G is relevant because of what? It tells you the sign of the maximum permanent primary surplus over debt. That is, if R is less than G, what you know now is that you can run permanent spending forever. You don't have to go back to permanent surpluses. And so R minus G is relevant. However, that does not mean that there is no constraint. And in particular, the present value of spending must stay below the current value of the debt, or the minus the current value of the debt, but spending can be relaxed by this bubble component of the debt that's really about M minus R. It's about the revenue that the government holds by issuing this debt. Okay, more public spending requires, by this identity, a higher bubble premium. But a higher bubble premium comes with lower bond holdings. And that means that there's a finite capacity, there's a finite fiscal capacity that shrinks with inequality in financial development. So if you're funding yourself, thinking about the bubble premium, be careful, because when you raise spending, the bubble premium must rise, but at the same time, now people want to hold less bonds relative to the capital stock, and that's what triggers this finiteness of the fiscal capacity. A fiscal rule, if we follow, depending on the fiscal rule, we can have debt runs. I wrote the S over B rule that had no debt runs and the S over A rule that has debt runs to highlight that. Aggregate uncertainty increases fiscal capacity. Foreign demand for bonds makes the capacity be hit sooner. How do we pay for the debt? Inflating the debt is a mistake. It makes the constraint tighter. It's a mistake again from the perspective of the bubble premium, the emphasis here. It will make constraints tighter. Inflating the debt makes constraints tighter. Financial repressions loosens the constraints, but at a very large cost. Redistribution, interesting. If you provide successful insurance-providing transfers, you on the one hand increase welfare in these economies or these incomplete markets, but at the same time, you make the benefits, whatever they are, of government spending, be lost because less government spending is now possible. The constraint now is tighter. The rise in partial income tax has a new non-Laffer effect, which is the rise in this tax is going to reallocate capital in the economy through financial markets, and that may tighten or loosen the borrowing constraint. So I'm at minus 15 seconds, so I'll go 30 seconds over time or 40 seconds over time. Conclusion. I started with this statement from the IMF World Economic Outlook back in October. Debt over GDP is at the highest level ever since we've measured it for 120 years, higher than after World War II. In advanced economies, significantly higher in emerging economies. I asked here, what is the constraint on how high blue and red can go when there's a bubble, just like Olivier asked, but unlike Olivier, when Piketty holds as well, when M is bigger than G. I ended up with lots of different conclusions from Olivier. There is no free lunch, bubbles have limits, there's an endogenous size to all of them. Policies may unexpectedly bring you closer or further to the limit. The crucial thing is to think of M minus R and B, to think throughout the thread of the whole lecture, is that you need to think through what does this do to the bubble premium? That's what the R less than G brings you, is that now you're thinking not just as we traditionally of economists when giving advice, we always give advice on debt, thinking here, what happens to the interest rate and growth of the economy, what happens to spending. Again, the IMF is one big machinery of calculating this, right? When we think about consolidation programs, austerity plans, how do different policies affect M, S, and G? And I said, well, with R less than G, there's now another term, and I try to explore how big, not how big that is, the quantitative questions are, but qualitatively, how does it change? How does it go up and down? It turns out it can often move in very different directions than what this term did. And that was the lessons from this exercise. Thank you very much.
Let me very quickly say that there were a couple of questions in the chat, which, however, I would like to defer to the Q&A at the end.
Okay, thanks, Ricardo, for your perfect timekeeping, and there was no bubble in your presentation. And so now I will give the floor to Daniel. So Daniel, you have also 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me try to, get my stuff. Do you see that? Yeah, is that okay?
Yes, perfect. Yeah, we see.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Ricardo. It's been for me a great pleasure to read your paper. I think it's almost fresh for, at least in my mind, for quasi teaching. It's very clear, it's neat, and as I think already everybody understood, as Olivier Garnier said, this is a very timely paper because it comes exactly at the time when the Biden administration seems to hear what Olivier Blanchard was saying about the fact that there is fiscal space and that they want to use it also. As you've all noticed, Olivier sort of wrenched with Larry Summer on the fact that maybe this fiscal push was too much. So what is a fiscal space for the Biden administration? That's the sort of thing that people, want to know. And the paper goes as far as giving a formula for this fiscal space. I'll come back to it. And I think more generally, the background is very clear. It's a situation in which interest rates are very low, below the growth rate, but this is not new. The fact that they are getting lower is a fact that we want to understand. And as Ricardo mentioned already many times, that is not in itself a sign that there is a dynamic inefficiency, because the rate of return of capital is above the growth rate of the economy. So there are many Blanchards that Ricardo is speaking with, and one of them I think is Blanchard and Weil, in which they exactly ask this question of whether we can issue bubbly debt in cases where the economy is efficient. This is a topic where there's a lot of French people around. There's Blanchard and Weil, Fary and Tirole, Fary and Goriot, and of course we think of Emmanuel Fary at this moment. There are Goranchas and all these guys. So the French are fascinated with the idea that the debt could never be repaid. So I think it's also very good that this presentation comes at this time in France right now. So there are obviously many questions which are underlying this paper, and the paper offers a framework to think about them. But certainly we want to understand why is it that real rates are so low right now, beside the fact that they are below the growth rate of the economy, which is more of a general feature. They are negative in real term in Europe. Can that last? The Biden stimulus, will that raise interest rate to the point where the premium, the bubbly, the liquidity premium will be lost? What does that imply for the price of assets? There's been a wide range of paper that have been addressing these issues. One of them, because Summers has been so vocal, is an important one for the policy debate with Rachel, in which they argue that it is really due to a rising gap between saving and investment within the OECD. It's not a China fact. And they give a list of explanations as to why this gap between saving and investment has been increasing over time. Aging, inequality may explain why saving is rising, and new technologies may explain why physical investment is declining, the kind of Uber-like investment which requires less physical capital than building a car factory. I say that because I want to return in the end to this kind of explanation and compare them with what Ricardo is saying in the paper. So there's really two things in the paper, and I will sort of start in reverse order. One is a reinterpretation of the budget constraint, and with not the R as a discount factor, but the M as a discount factor to assess the transversality condition somehow that the public debt is subject to. I understand the logic. I'm not fully convinced, and I'll close my comments with that, although I find the way it is spelled out very, very interesting and certainly to be digged in. I will propose an alternative way of thinking to this interruptible budget constraint of the government. And then there is a model, a very interesting model with clear-cut implication. Let me start with the model, which again I find very neat and to a certain extent straightforward as far as the logic is concerned, and with a lot of interesting and sometimes paradoxical implications so far as policy are concerned, in particular the relationship between redistribution and the fiscal space. So in essence, the model tries to understand these inequalities, the Piketty cum Blanchard kind of inequality, R smaller than G, that's Blanchard, G smaller than M being the marginal return to physical capital, being really in effect what Thomas has in mind when he makes a comparison with the G. The bulk of the model is an AK version of, this is an AK model, so that there's no aggregate uncertainty. So if there is no aggregate uncertainty, the rate of return M is a constant. Somehow all the returns should be converging towards M. Even if you are risk neutral, you should go towards M because there is no aggregate uncertainty. So the model tried to explain why you should still have something of this kind. And the answer, once the problem is set up in such a neat context, can only be because there are constraints on the ability of people to hold the assets that generate the return M. Again, it's not, and Nuno's comment, I think, was well taken at this stage because there's zero aggregate uncertainty. Why is it that even the most risk-averse guy should not hold the K? Well, because there are constraints of the Kiyotaki-Moore kind of nature, and therefore agents cannot fully close the gap between R and M, and therefore R can remain below M because some agents cannot invest in capital. The entrepreneurs in capitalism themselves cannot fully borrow up to their needs. So in the end, the losers have to buy T-bills, and that's the essence of one of the essence. There are some liquidity premium also granted by the T-bills, but in essence, the arbitrage cannot be perfectly done because you cannot just borrow and buy the capital stock as much as you would want, and there's not enough room to lend credit to the capitalist because of those borrowing constraints. So that allows the interest rate to be potentially below the growth rate of the economy, and therefore, because R is bigger than G, this allows potentially the government to run a Ponzi scheme in which they simply borrow at R and never repay, just refinance rollover forever without any contradiction, because of the fact that this rollover would generate a sort of increase of the debt to a potentially R rate of growth, which is, as we all know from the Diamond model or from the Samuelson overlapping generation model earlier on, because of the fact that it's smaller than G, there's no contradiction to refinancing forever after the debt without having to generate any surplus. All right. So there is a closed form solution, at least in one of the simplified model that is presented for the fiscal space of the government. It is how much a government can borrow without having to resort to a positive primary surplus. And this is the formula. Everything is really straightforward. M is a return on capital accumulation. Alpha is a share of winners, those who can invest. Gamma is a liquidity constraint that is imposed upon the investor. When gamma equals to 1, there's no liquidity, no borrowing constraint. When gamma equals 0, then there is a maximum borrowing constraint, that is you cannot borrow it to invest in your capital, and rho is a subjective discount factor. So you see that this is really, and there is an equilibrium if R is bigger than M, of course, which is model specific, but among other things, so R is a fraction of M, and the fraction is also lower than gamma, which is a measure of fiscal repression, is low. So when gamma is 0, you cannot borrow at all to invest in your own capital stock, then R can fall to 0. Otherwise, it is a fraction. So you cannot have here with this condition, but I think this is, again, very easy to change. You cannot have negative real rates as a condition for positive debt. And we know that we have negative real rates certainly in Europe today, but I think it's relatively easy to fix. But this is really a model of financial repression. That is, the more repressed the economy, the larger the fiscal space. It's very obvious. Ricardo, repeated it, and there is a limit. If you see gamma, for instance, is equal to 1 minus alpha, S becomes negative. So there is a limit really on financial repression, on financial liberalization that is needed in order to sustain this fiscal space. So this opens up a wide range of questions as to whether this is the model that we want to understand what's been going on over the past 30, 40 years. And obviously, it is unfair to try to fit in all the data that we have in mind on such a model whose main virtue is that it's a very clear-cut model of some implications of financial repression and the signaling of the effect of going too far in the direction of financial liberalization. But then let's just say, as one of the facts that we would want to investigate in view of this model, what has been going on over the last 40 years, which explain why the interest rate, the riskless rate has fallen. It's hard to argue that it is because of the fact that financial repression in the advanced economy has been reinforced. To some extent, it's almost the opposite. We have the feeling that big financial liberalization of the past 30 years are the main factor of the time that we live. And there is rather this feeling that there is more complementarity than substitutability between financial sophistication and the need for riskless assets. So somehow, I think a simple version of the CAPM will explain why, when you need more sort of sophisticated financial product, you need more riskless asset as a complement to those products. So that opens a discussion which has been analyzed by the scarcity of riskless asset by, again, Fahry and Goran Schatz and all these guys. More generally, I think we should think of putting down the consequences of this model as opposed to alternative theory of the equity premium, because after all, M minus R is nothing else but the equity premium. And we know that this is something which is still resisting or thinking. It may be not risk aversion, but loss aversion, which is driving that up. So I think the implication would be completely different if simply we would explain M minus R as a reflection of misperceived risk, or at least, again, loss aversion as driving that, or extreme risk maybe underlying all these things. It would be interesting to see how much of the policy implication would resist this comparison with alternative theory of the equity premium puzzle, and see how much of the policy implication would sort of resist this comparison. So let me now go to again, the beginning of the paper, which I find most interesting, which is how do we understand the interval budget constraint of the government in situation when R is smaller than G. So let me just come back to the straightforward equation. So let me call Z the primary surplus, which is minus S the primary deficit. I'll come back to S in 1 second. So in the standard model of the kind that are analyzed in debt sustainability analysis of the IMF, the equation that everybody uses, at least asymptotically, is that in the long run, for debt to be sustainable, it has to be that Z is equal to R minus G times D. When D is, I differ D from B by saying that D is a debt to GDP ratio, and B would be simply the absolute amount of debt. So it's very straightforward. When R bigger than G, in order to sustain D equals 100% of GDP, if D, R minus G is 2%, then you need to be able to generate a primary surplus of 2%, all right? And if you can't, you have to default. Let me just open a parenthesis, but very quickly, which is that this relationship, which is a way of thinking as to what is the effort needed to sustain debt. If I have my 2% primary surplus and R minus G is also 2%, I can sustain safely a debt to GDP of 100%. In practice, when you look at the cause of debt crisis, it is not because of this equation that there are debt problems. It's because debt to GDP is jumping discontinuously because of exchange rate crisis, because of banking crisis, and things like that. And I have a paper exactly on that, why in a Brownian world, this equation holds true, but in a Poisson world, you can have a risk of debt crisis because there are some discontinuity, and that takes us back somehow to the equity premium puzzle literature. But let me move from there and just say that we understand the logic of that, and this is where the interpretable budget constraint would exactly fit in. The present value of all of these must be able to sustain the current amount of debt in order for the country to respect the transversality condition. Now let's move to the other case, the puzzling case. When R is smaller than G, the equation still holds true, and it is used obviously by Ricardo. You change the sign, you call S the primary deficit, that is non-interest bearing deficit, and the relationship still holds. It's just an accounting equation in any steady state. When D, which is debt to GDP, is a constant, it has to be correlated to an S, which is that. So how do we make sense of this interpretation? The first line is very straightforward. In order to sustain D, you need to implement a D. And the larger the D in the first equation, the larger needs to be the primary surplus that you need to generate. Italy needs to generate primary surplus, which is above France for the simple reason that both R and D are bigger. Now, how do we interpret that? That's sort of the mystery that the first part of the paper tries to analyze. You don't want to say that the larger D, the larger the S that you have access to. If you move from 100% to debt to GDP to 100 to 200%, you don't want to argue that then, that's fine. You can double the primary surplus. So there's here a little bit of misunderstanding as to the meaning of this relationship. So let me go very briefly on the way I would reinterpret it. I don't think it is anything controversial, but I think it changed a little bit the meaning of whether we have an interpretable budget constraint or not arising from this equation. The first line here is an accounting trick. I hope everybody is familiar with that. The increase in present value term of debt, BT e to the power of minus RT minus B0, is simply equal to the sum of the primary deficit in present value term. This is an accounting equation when R is the rate of interest paid on the debt by the government. There's no theory here. It's really another way of writing the law of motion of debt between 0 and T and cumulatively add up the primary deficit in order to understand by how much the debt has been increasing. So that's a fact. There's no way you can escape from that. So let me assume that the primary deficit is rising with the GDP, so which is G. So let me take S0 as the deficit to GDP ratio, taking GDP at time 0 to be 1. So that's absolutely straightforward. You can reintegrate this relationship by substituting ST by S0 e to the power of GT, integrating it here. And what does that give you when you calculate the debt to GDP ratio, which is BT divided by the GDP again being e to the power of GT, assuming Q0 to be 1? Well, it gives you this very straightforward relationship, which is that the debt to GDP ratio is the sum of those two terms. If S0 is 0, well, it's straightforward. The debt to GDP falls down with G minus R. That's a standard. That's Blanchard view. There's no problem in issuing more debt if you can do that, assuming the rate of interest to be constant. I'll come back to that in 1 second. If you have S0 positive, what it shows is that in the very long run, the debt to GDP ratio, you know, as Ricardo wrote down, converge towards S0 divided by G minus R. Again, this is purely arithmetic, so this is embedded in what obviously Ricardo is doing, but the way I interpret it is very straightforward. It is somehow a version of Tirol's model when he looks at the valuation of firms, but let me skip that. When S0 is positive, then the debt to GDP ratio is driven by S0 over G minus R. So if you return to this equation, what it really says is that debt in the long run is equal to S divided by G minus R. Therefore, that the more S you have, the more D you have. And the question is, in the end, it boils down in the end to what happens to the interest rate when you raise S and correspondingly raise D. That's a question that we want to address. So let me close on that. I think that, you know, whatever the model, in the end, and if you want to know what is the fiscal space, or whether you write it, it boils down to what is the ability to raise the debt to GDP ratio without having the interest rate switching above the growth rate, assuming that you have zero ability to generate a primary surplus. So let me, and that would be the implication of exactly this equation. You go to the point where the, you know, S becomes 0 and G is equal to R, and the question is not responded by this equality, because it would be straightforward. It would be responded by what is the amount of debt that will bring simply R to G. So let me give you a back of the envelope calculation, which is back to Blanchard somehow, but so that we know what we are talking about. The sort of median assumption, also Summers makes the same sort of assumption, is that an increase of 1% of the debt to GDP ratio lifts interest by 3 basis points. So if you take the fiscal stimulus of Biden, it's really the sum of the 1,900 that has been a billion that has been publicized, plus the 900 that has been voted late December by the former Congress, but after Biden's election. So the sum of the two makes for a fiscal stimulus and an increase of debt of 13% of GDP. Yes. So that has the potential to lift up interest by 40 basis points, 3 times 13. And that's more or less what has happened since the Biden election. Maybe a little bit more, but not that much, at least in nominal terms. So a little bit more in nominal terms, maybe slightly less in real terms. There is a range, obviously, it's between 2 and 4. So I think what we are observing is within this range. So that gives us immediately an answer to what is the room for fiscal expansion. Well, if you believe that today the real rates are 0, the potential growth rate is 1.5, then that gives you a room for another 50%. And then the question is, when you reach that point, you know, will you reduce growth? And that's, again, why we need paper like the one that Ricardo has been presenting, to understand what happens when production is efficient, when the equilibrium is efficient and you raise public debt. Well, the answer in the end boils down to the question of whether this fiscal stimulus will lift up growth permanently, whether it will just be a boom, of course, or whether it lifts it up permanently, which goes back to the question of where do you invest? Is it growth enhancing? Therefore, are we so sure that after all growth was efficient, taking account of all the externalities that we know related to infrastructure and all this stuff? So I think we need, at this stage, we really need a model like the one that Ricardo has been developing to understand the close-knit relationship between fiscal stimulus and equilibrium growth. And again, I thank you, Ricardo. Really enjoy reading your paper, and I've learned a lot, and I think I will teach it. And but I think this is really the starting point of a long companionship to understand what is going on in those days. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So although we are late, but I think we have time to take some questions. But maybe, Ricardo, if you want, maybe in 2 minutes, start maybe if you want to comment on what Daniel said, and then we will take a round of questions.
Absolutely, very briefly. First of all, thank you very much, Daniel. I agree with 99.9%, I think, of what you said. Maybe not with a comma or a full stop here and there. But yes, I mean, I think these debt arithmetics, I think we agree exactly, and hopefully the audience also understood this, which is, you can look at these debt arithmetics different ways. I looked at them in some ways, Daniel complimented in other ways, but at some point you realize you're just rearranging terms left and right, and you just have to write what happens to the M minus R, G minus R, and what's going on. Which is not to say that these arithmetics are not insightful. Like you saw how Daniel discussed it in that graph. Everything he said was consistent with what I said, and yet it was different. And that's just, again, how these arithmetics, I think, are both useful, but also you really can't stop in them in terms of saying that. So I want to make that clear for the audience. One point, though, which I would highlight is there's a difference here, especially with regards to your last calculations with the Biden plan, Daniel, is the difference here between permanent and transitory, of course. And that's, I think, an important one, which is I was always I wrote the paper thinking always, okay, how much more can we permanently spend? And that's where, when I thought about how much to permanently spend, or even recurrently spend, I mean, if you don't want to take the permanent too seriously, but persistently spend, you come up with these M minus R showing up and these bubble premiums. And that's what leads to kind of my language always in terms of these extra terms and so on. There is, if you think in terms of a one-time impulse to S, a transitory, then you're in that deficit gamble type range. And then you really want to think as of G minus R, precisely for the reasons that Daniel said, because it's really just about how much can you push it before the thing turns and instead of converging to zero, explodes to plus infinity. So when you think about deficit gambles, it's exactly about the G minus R. It's exactly what Daniel said in terms of, well, Mr. Biden, you can do, how big is your 2021 stimulus? As big as you don't let the G cross the R or the R cross the G. If you think about the permanent spending and how permanent this can be, then you have to think, well, G minus R isn't really the right number. It's M minus R. And not that R would cross M, but it's how big that is relative to the total amount of debt and these other calculations. And that is the reason why I highlight this, is that is something that I think is something that's become quite relevant, especially in the US debate, Daniel, somewhat also, by the way, in the European debate, which is when it starts with the argument, we need a very large fiscal expansion now, temporary, but large for different reasons, 2020. And then how large can it be? Well, let's think about G minus R. Can we pay for it? Let's pay for it over the next 5 to 10 years. But then what you see in the public debate, and that shows up a lot in the Biden plan, is, oh, but this is a great opportunity to pursue my permanent spending that I loved, and look at the European package, digitalization, green economy, and this and that. Well, but those are permanent spending plans. And once you're starting to doing permanent spending plans, when talking about transitory, you have to start getting very careful. And that's where these rooms get a little smaller. And that I think is an important, just from a perspective of public debate. This isn't changing the economics or anything, but that's usually permanent transfer is one that I wanted to highlight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we can take a first round of 3 questions, and then you respond at the end, Ricardo. So maybe you have also a virtual hand on WebEx, so you can raise your hand. But maybe I don't know, Gilles Simple, Gilles, you were very active on the chat. I don't know if you want to start, and then I could see there was also questions by Nuno or Jocelyn or Sylvain Boyer. But Gilles, you want to start? Or somebody else, as long as I cannot see if there are any hand raised.
I can, yeah.
Who starts?
If you want, I can ask.
Jocelyn, you raised your hand, so Jocelyn, you have the floor.
Hi, many thanks, Ricardo, for this very interesting presentation. I had something I was confused during the presentation about is what is the M object in the model with aggregate uncertainty? Is it still defined like in the model without aggregate uncertainty as the marginal return to capital in the absence of aggregate uncertainty, or does that definition change? And if it doesn't change, what would be that object in the data? And the one that we are measuring at the beginning with the marginal return on capital, that includes aggregate uncertainty. So my question would be that.
That's an easy answer and straightforward. I mean, so when I did the aggregate uncertainty, I used the M was then the average marginal product of capital. And because that was the one that allowed me to do a much clearer correspondence to what's going on. But as I try to highlight, of course, from my arguments, you would want to use not the average, and that's deterministic, but rather use as an SDF, the one that includes the aggregate uncertainty, and then consider the covariances that I discussed earlier. But to show immediately the impact, I thought it was just easier to use the average MPK, because then you see the extra term, and then these covariance quantitative terms wouldn't show up, not because they're not important, but just in order to highlight qualitatively what changed. In terms of measurement, you have to be a little careful, or maybe I should be a little careful, because in figure 1 on the first slide, I showed you equity returns, but that's the leverage marginal part of capital. In my model, for instance, that's M divided by 1 minus gamma M over R, right? Because that's what you get because you're able to get the leverage and how much the equity holder got. Whereas this M is really the marginal product of capital. That is the unlevered return in the capital stock. But this is a standard correction that people, so instead of just reading off the equity premium, in my graph 3, I had instead a return to capital, and one can look at the unlevered return on risky assets in the economy. As you noted, that's going to change over time. Note, by the way, that in my calculations, it's okay if it changes over time deterministically. So there's nothing wrong with it fluctuating. It doesn't have to be a constant. It has to converge somewhere, and so far as there's a well-defined limit, but it's okay if it fluctuates. But then again, when I ignore the uncertainty, all I'm ignoring is an extra covariance term that shows up that quantitatively is important, but I don't know. I guess I could do that, but I just thought I already had so many new things going on that I thought that talking about the covariance was not the first order thing, but yeah.
Okay, Sylvain, I can see you raised your hand. Sylvain, you have to unmute. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Olivier, and thank you to the Paris School of Economics for having such interesting debates. And no, I was interested at listening to Ricardo's view on the European Capital Markets Union. So I'm a bit biased, so I will not. I'm not listening at the today's conference under the view of the debt sustainability, but under the objective, the political objective in the EU set by the Capital Markets Union to reduce the equity temperament, to rechannel this large pool of savings we have in Europe, which is widely ineffectively allocated to more to a higher share on bank deposits, to a higher share of equity, especially to finance and to fill possibly the SME equity gap, and so there are different proposals to do that. One is to increase the financial literacy of savers, access to independent financial advice, but there are also other ways to do that. For instance, giving more flexibility in the regulative framework for institutional investors to increase more in equity, and so all to reduce the possible financial repression we have in Europe. So I was interested to hear about Ricardo's views on the Capital Markets Union project. Thank you.
Two perspectives. Certainly, increasing the depth of financial markets and thus the allocation towards high quality projects should be a priority from perspective of economic growth, of welfare, even of reduction of inequality, if one has that goal. And obviously one can only applaud initiatives that deepen financial literacy and lead to that happening. And in my model, as Danielle pointed, yes, there will be an increase in gamma. That is certainly a positive that reduces, that increases growth and wealth in the economy. At the same time, that reduces the demand for your public debt. And that's what I'm highlighting here with the fiscal capacity and the fiscal space calculations. If you have a better developed economy where we can lend to each other, we can invest in the stock market, we don't need to save as much in government bonds. And that will tighten fiscal capacity. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, on the other hand, you can say, well, but I'm collecting revenues in a richer economy, and that's perfectly fine. But let's be clear that the more countries with less developed financial markets are those in which the public debt market is more important, occupies a higher role, and there's a bigger premium on it. That's in the spirit of the calculation in this paper. So that's the first comment. I mean, that we can't, maybe I'm just being too much of an economist here. There's always a negative and a pro to everything. I mean, you're going to reduce the amount of public debt if you allow people to, if people aren't just putting their money in banks, depositing in banks who then buy bonds, or they're not buying bonds directly, well, to buy equity, that will happen. But secondly, important, on the last 10 years, there I'm more, how should I say, open-minded on what developments we had. Because yes, there may have been some efforts on the capital market union towards more investment in equity markets, But on the other hand, this is also the decade of macroprudential policy. It's the decade of telling banks you have to hold government bonds, because after all, a world in which we citizens deposit in banks and banks buy equity may not be one that you may like from an equality risk-bearing capacity, but is one that would work perfectly fine in terms of allocation of capital. But instead, we're saying that, well, for all the deposits that people have in banks, now banks have to hold a much larger share than before in government bonds, which is impeding precisely the flow of asset economy. all the multitude of regulation and our now very high aversion towards any form of financial stability has meant that there is a gigantic demand for government bonds and has led to, again, motivating the RNG literature to these extremely low yields on government bonds. And especially in Europe, with the lack of a euro safe asset, in Germany and Holland, the countries that issue the AAA debt, we see very clearly that how very low their yields are. And I think a non-negligible part of it, not to say a significant part of it, is driven precisely by policies of regulation that have increased the safety premium on that debt by making safety much more valuable, much more demanded, much more needed and desired to satisfy the regulators by that banking system. Likewise, again, the increase in aversion to risk, either from the private side or the public side, has been one of the elements that many researchers have tried to investigate, I think so far with somewhat inconclusive results, on whether this has worsened the allocation of capital. Has the M actually fallen somewhat? Has productivity fallen? Because after the financial crisis, we have not been able to have financial markets allocating capital as well across sectors as we did, perhaps because of regulation, again, perhaps because of private aversion. Note that, again, M minus R is key, and as you're thinking about these policies, some are affecting M, some are affecting R, and they're affecting the gap. But I'm not sure that in the last 10 years, whether European just policy has helped towards improve the efficiency of allocation of capital. I personally think it's got actually more the other way around. I think the efforts that people buy stocks have been more than offset by the dissuading of banks to hold equity. I'll end just with one observation that, I don't know, I find interesting, some people find interesting, but I find it quite striking that in the middle of the largest recession ever, unexpected, no way you could have provisioned it. That implies that, for instance, people who had restaurants and had loans to the bank, usually be considered very safe loans, are now becoming risky. And yet, in spite of that, all the stress tests from the Banque de France, and especially from the ECB, have said no problem at all in the banking sector. Now, on the one hand, that's great. We're not going to have a financial crisis. On the other hand, wow, how can we go through the recession in the private sector of the last 12 months and not a single bank in the whole of Europe is in trouble? That tells me that maybe we've overregulated the banking sector. Let me say this, perhaps a little provocatively. But, you know, if you're heading to the airport and you catch 3 flat tires, 2 traffic jams, a hurricane, and an earthquake, which is pretty much what the economy has gone through the last 12 months, and you still make your airplane on time, you're probably going to the airport a little too early.
If there last question, I cannot see any more hands raised, but if there is, Daniel, do you have any final comment?
Sure. Let me say a few things. And again, you know, as Ricardo said, we're looking at the same things with different angles, and I think they should complement one another, certainly not contradict one another. I've just two points. One is about what you very rightfully said, Ricardo, about whether it's one-off or permanent. In fact, I was thinking in the context of the French Maastricht kind of debate, should we target a debt to GDP ratio of any one sort? And my gut reaction is no. It's pointless to target 60%, 100%. What we should target is the interest cost, interest corrected for inflation times debt to GDP. Today in France, it has moved from 3% to 1.5% in nominal term, and in real term, the cost of the debt is 0.3%. So there's no way we have reached any kind of limit. But having said that, exactly what your paper is all about, that doesn't mean that there is no limit. So if I was trying to think within this context, what is the upper limit? It would have to be not debt in itself, but for instance, what is the point where the interest cross the growth rate? In fact, obviously, we can go a bit further because we have some capacity to have a primary surplus. I think endogenizing at one point or ability to have a primary surplus, of course, this is the pro domo argument, is important because not everything cannot be endogenous, but the government is a moment when it has to be somehow endogenized. But still, the answer would be, according to the calculation that I've presented for the US, you can run another 50%. So maybe 200% debt to GDP in the US would be the sort of upper limit. Because here, in the sort of elasticity of interest to debt. This is really the elasticity of interest to the absolute level of debt, right? This is what we are talking about. So of course, in your framework somehow, but my framework, S is permanent. So S declines G. So I have something where S, shuts down when D has been reached, when the upper limit of D has been reached. I think this is where maybe some element of confusion comes from. So yeah, maybe after all, the US are not that far, the upper limit as far as the debt to GDP ratio. Of course, this takes a non-Ricardian model to think about the relationship between the two, but that's the world I think in which we live. I want to add just one thing which is always missing in this discussion, and that's the role of inflation. So yes, of course, the logic of your paper is very straightforward. Expected inflation plays no role. It's only the variance, and it's a bad thing because it creates a sort of premium, a risk premium on a supposedly riskless instrument. This is a profound argument. I mean, when we say the debt is riskless, it is not in real terms because of inflation. So I think it's a well-taken point, and the theoretical thing is obviously important. But the world in which we live right now is not quite that one. I think it's completely different from what we are talking about. And this is somehow related to the Taylor rule. Sorry to say odd words in such a context, but we have low inflation because wages are low. They are de-anchored. We don't know why. We don't know if it's lasting. Maybe in the US, we see that after all, there is a point when the Phillips curves regain strength. But there's something outside our model which is going on. The Taylor rule says that interest rate, riskless rate, is 1.5, the deviation of inflation with targets. So that's the world in which we live in Europe. Interests are very low because we are off track. This is for Olivier, Garnier, and the Banque de France. We are off track of target. Whether this is consistent with the model, with long-run properties, the truth is that we don't quite know. But I think in practical terms, the discussion, let's say so far as Europe is concerned, is really about that missing point, which is not in our discussion because, and Summers and Rachel, for instance, do not make once this point, which is, I think, critical because we live in a world with nominal rigidity and what have you, and there's something that we don't understand about the Phillips curves, but I don't want to close this discussion without sort of re-anchoring it into the real world by this observation, that after all, interest rates are low because inflation is low, and the Taylor rule says we should overreact both ways to such situation.
And thank you to both of you. I will not open again the discussion, but just listening to Daniel, I would say on the one hand, I agree with him that at the end of the day, what is important is the impact of debt on interest rates. But on the other hand, that's a reason why I would not agree that the new benchmark should be the interest to GDP ratio, because I'm not sure that this indicator would be the right way to assess the potential effects of debt on interest rates. And so just with this kind of, if you say, for instance, there is, as long as interest payments are below 2% of GDP, there is no problem, then you could go easily with a debt to GDP ratio of 200% of GDP, and then maybe it's too late when you get the impact on interest rates. But I will not open the discussion on that. We will have other opportunities to discuss it. And thanks, Ricardo. I really loved your paper. I think it was a nice way, the key point, the key lesson I draw is that in the standard diamond overlapping generation model, when R is below G, then increasing debt is welfare improving. In your model, you have, and it was also acknowledged by Sylvain, there is a kind of trade-off between fiscal space and welfare. So it's not a free lunch, and maybe we have to think how we could also reduce this kind of demand for liquidity and security, because maybe when you have some kind of a shortage of safe assets, the way maybe to solve this bubble is not necessarily to increase the supply of safe assets, but maybe to see whether or not there are distortions fueling the demand for safe assets. So thank you, and sorry for having a little bit allowed some slippage in time, but I think it was worth for the discussion. And thanks again. Bye bye.
Let me just jump in there and thank Olivier for hosting. Thank both of our speakers, Ricardo and Danielle, for such great presentations and all the questions, and apologizing to those in the chat for mistreating their questions that I didn't voice. But I think we had a great discussion. So thanks to everybody again, also from Chair Banque de France side.